current pandemic has opened a window to questioning the status quo. It's allowed us a period to rewire collective thinking and to show how responsive we can be for good and for bad. Adaptability and the ability to change are absolutely key in these moments of shifts, not just with the new coronavirus, but with climate change and growing civil unrest. And so I want to welcome everybody who's here for this exciting session of the first session of Dialogues for Artists in a Changing World. And I just want to tell you a tiny bit about why it came about, its genesis. So a lot of you, like me, have probably had important projects postponed or cancelled given the current situation. And rather than dwell on the postponement of a solo show that I was planned to have in London, I was, and also encouraged by the fact that I was reading in the press some small kind of glimpses of critically alert writing that was quite hopeful. I thought, well, how can we do something constructive and respond constructively to the situation? And so, Dialogues for Artists in a Changing World was born. Now, I decided to do something online, and that word something is really vague. And actually, I realized that that vagueness was its very strength and the power of it. So rather than work on projects that are inflexible and have a lot of structure to be worked on, is to try and create situations that are more adaptable and more flexible. And so these dialogues are my contribution to the conversation today. But it's really our conversation. So I really believe in this idea of collective meaning making. And so that's why we've got these amazing speakers today. I'd like to introduce Jane Clatworthy, who's joining us from London, Conor Walton, who's joining us from Ireland, and Michael Pearce, who's joining us from California. So we really are spread across the globe, and we wouldn't be able to do it if it weren't for this virtual environment. And thank you for everybody who's joined us here. Before we start, I just want to throw out a few ideas close to my interests. As a painter and as someone who's interested in the theory and the ideas around the conversation for painting and its reception today. And this is where also I think the other three speakers come together in their interests. So the title of the session today is Envisioning New Futures and Telling New Stories Through Pigment. So I'm not going to go into any details, but all forms of art express visions of the world. And we're still very much in the wake of humanism. Despite many critiques and questionings that have been rocking the humanist world, it is very much the model that we are either reacting against or trying to recuperate things from or positioning ourselves with, in relation to, I should say. And so how does that relate to painting? So Renaissance painting and art was profoundly anthropocentric. Perspective has the human being at its very core. The orchestration of pictorial space is actually around this individual, which is the viewing position, which then actually organizes the pictorial space. So you have exciting things happening and quite scandalous things happening then, because there's almost a dethroning of God. So suddenly you get these amazing images like Mantegna's Christ, and it is actually subject to human perspective. You suddenly have Christ or religious icons subject to the human being, that becomes the orchestrating principle. But today we're in the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is a period marked quite catastrophically by human beings. And so maybe this anthropocentric vision isn't so helpful anymore. And so postmodernism, with all its good and bad, threw away quite a lot of babies in the very dirty bathwater. And we need to start constructing and reconstructing and rebuilding around what was left after postmodernism. These are very complex times, but there's a shift to a more I'm reluctant to use the word hopeful, but I am going to say hopeful, constructive point of view. And we need new stories, new mythologies, and new meta-narratives. And so I'd like to invite the speakers today, and I'm going to ask a very quick question to each of them. So once again, to those of you who've joined a little bit late, the speakers that we've got are Jane Clatworthy, who's joining us from London, Conor Walton, who's joining us from Ireland, Michael Pearce from California, and I'm Elina Cerla, and I'm here in Barcelona. So I think I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, you talk about this wonderful metaphor of the bubble bath and this notion of emergence. And to throw in a more complex question to that, you have talked about the nihilism that has been conditioning kind of a postmodernist worldview and the need for new meta-narratives. And I'd like you to just very quickly introduce us to the idea of these, this wonderful bubble bath idea.
So the bubble bath idea is pretty simple, really. It's a sort of summary of postmodern thought. So as postmodernism has invaded culture, we find that different art worlds have been generated, and they bump into each other and know each other and deflate and inflate. And it's all part of this idea of emergence, that art worlds emerge from the mass rather than being dictated from the top down. In the 20th century, we had a hegemony of avant-gardism that kind of dominated the art world and dictated what was acceptable and right. And now with postmodernity, we've evolved into this new world where there are many art worlds. They don't seem to have much in common with each other quite a lot of the time. If you look at the auction art world, the one-percenter art world, they're going along minding their own business and trading money and using art like stock certificates. It has very little to do with the representational art world, where people are making art for the sake of mostly for people to for the marketplace, right? For people to buy, and that's a much more populist kind of art, I believe. The imaginative realist art world definitely more populist than the auction art world. But that's not to say that these things are entirely distinct. They do bump into each other and overlap. So instead of one big bubble of avant-gardism, you've got multiple bubbles for different kinds of art. You wouldn't see the pre-Raphaelite art group on Facebook taking any criticism from the avant-gardists lightly. It would be like being savaged by a herd of pre-Raphaelites, right? Can you imagine?
So we're going to get into the conversation, the four of us, but before, just to start off, I'm going to throw out a question to each of the speakers. So Conor, you have this concept of asymmetrical warfare, and the way in which the artist, and especially the painter, needs to act in the current situation. Could you tell us a little bit more about those ideas?
Okay, well, we've all, I suppose, probably heard about the death of the avant-garde, and you know, the avant-garde is obviously a sort of military metaphor for this advanced group with the, you know, the main force arriving up behind. You know, it's sort of leads, and that obviously struck me as, you know, and a lot of other people as rather obsolete. So given the death of the avant-garde and other things, you know, where do we stand? So the idea of asymmetrical warfare appealed to me. Asymmetrical warfare is essentially sort of insurgency. And it's, you know, it's characterized by an insurgency against a much more powerful adversary, or depending on which way you look at it, sort of guerrilla warfare. And that struck me as an interesting notion to maybe adopt or adapt to our purposes, because I think at this point, what we call representational art, or what is traditionally accepted as representational art, is a rather small and marginal subfield. You know, what we often when people talk about representational art, they're often talking about painting and sculpture. And it's like it's an 18th century notion. And, printmaking is sort of allowed in photography, isn't really discussed, and certainly, movies and television, which is where most of us really get our culture, these are the mainstream forms. They aren't really included in this discussion. And this struck me as something that is to some extent limiting. Now, obviously, the painting and sculpture are very traditional arts, and they're not the arts of mass media and mass reproduction. But the question is how we adapt to a world which is dominated by that high tech and by, the big broadcasters. So I thought asymmetrical warfare was sort of an interesting way to, in the internet age, essentially colonize this world, to adapt to it by using art to produce memes, viral content, and I suppose, what you might call stunts, the sort of things that you have to do to get attention in the age of mass media. And I think of it as a little bit like thinking like a terrorist, thinking like a subversive, not thinking that, the avant-garde is dead, so we can go back to the Renaissance. The Renaissance is gone. Our position is marginal. And we have to basically accept that and maybe, look at, fighting our war with bows and arrows, but against much better armed adversaries.
Thank you. So Jane, in your work, you question and you engage with notions of implicit bias in the way in which we look at things and in the subject matter. And I'm really interested in this idea of work being able to challenge and question and make people kind of reformulate their implicit biases. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think as we go forward, we have to, and we need to tell new stories. Perhaps what we need to do is actually look at the backstory and who controlled how the story was told. The patriarchy have had a stranglehold on the gaze going back ever since man made God in his own image. And, through all of the years, we've had this phallocentric culture. And I think the male body in its entirety and unveiled has been hidden. And it's been hidden because to reveal the vulnerability is to disempower this sort of phallocentric culture. Once you take the phallus and the penis and you separate the two, what you're left with is a very, very vulnerable male body. And that starts to, upend the power structures. In a nutshell. So, I think one of the ways that we can actually sort of push back against this culture, and it's pervasive. I mean, if you look at art, even the art that's being made today, the woman's body is the body that tells the story. The mythologies we're creating are created with the woman's body. And, my question is, why are we not looking back? Why are we not using the sort of vulnerable masculine to create spaces for those new stories? I mean, the masculine is not used to seeing itself in a vulnerable position. And in this world at the moment, that's actually problematic for men as a whole. We have toxic masculinity, which is spewing all kinds of crap into the world. So what I'm interested in doing is in weaving those stories and creating that sort of space for men even to look back at themselves and experience that space where they can start to challenge, I suppose, the traditional ideals of masculinity.
So we've got lots of bubbles. We're in one of the marginal bubbles, trying to reformulate things. And I wonder how we engage with the materiality of the paint and how that actually the way in which, for example, the memes of content are also linked to the embodiment of the making. And I'm throwing this out as a question, and I'd love us to try and kind of throw questions at one another as well, see how that can work.
You know, we were talking last week about how important it is to actually be in front of the physicality of the painting, and that the impact of art perhaps is lost on screen. But, you know, with Generation Z coming up, they only know the screen, and it's going to be quite hard to get them into physical spaces where they can actually experience the art. So but at the same time, I think that experiencing that art is absolutely critical. I mean, when I was moved to tears by Rembrandt's Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph, I absolutely don't think for 1 second I would have been moved to tears if I'd seen that on the screen. In fact, I look at it on the screen now and I'm like, what the hell? But, you know, standing there in that moment, it's almost as though standing in front of that painting and, you know, experiencing, it was almost as though there was a sort of a loop in the time-space continuum. And I kind of stood right next to Rembrandt while he was experiencing that painting. And I think that's the right of every human to experience that kind of reaction. It's a sort of, you know, just a moment where we can glimpse the divine, if you like, or a glitch in the matrix. But how do we do that in this world that's this digital world in front of us? And I think that's part of the dialogue. How do we compete?
I think this is very temporary. I'm not at all concerned about COVID in that regard. We're going to be back in the museums. We've got museums opening up even now. They're already planning on opening the Louvre on the 5th of June, I believe it is. Other museums all around the world are opening up. So I'm not worried about the immediacy of the experience of paintings at all. But I do think that the experience, as you say, Jane, is completely different when you look at something online and when you look at it in reality, of course. And but I think that's a good thing in a way, because what we do as painters and sculptors is to make a real thing. Whereas when you work on a computer and you're making digital art, you're making something that only exists in pixels and you can't touch it. It's immaterial and doesn't exist as a real thing unless it's printed, and then it's always secondary to the initial creative act, right? And when you're making a painting or a sculpture, obviously you can have that immediate contact with Rembrandt or whoever it is. But what I've noticed among my students is that those of them who are digital artists and are training to be new designers and graphic designers and animators and whatnot, when they go to a gallery and they see material paint, they're blown away by it. They are really, really impressed that people like us have done this in the past and have done it for a couple of thousand years and have managed to master it so thoroughly. So I think that there's another layer to this experience that shouldn't be dismissed. And another part of it is that the digital experience can add so many layers of meaning to the experience of the material experience. But I remember seeing that famous picture of the schoolgirls at the Louvre, and they're all looking at their cell phones, and everyone went crazy about this image that they were all terrible people because they aren't looking at the night watch or whatever it was behind them. And I thought that's nonsense. You don't know what they're looking at. They're probably looking at all the information about the night watch and learning about the night watch, or at least some of them. So there's, you know, it's not so simple as we think. I think there's more layers of meaning to the digital experience and to the material experience.
I think I'm very much a traditional painter, and the resistance, the tactile aspect of painting is very important to me, very important in how I create the image. But I think for the reception of the image, the vast majority, just in crude numbers, the vast majority of people who see my paintings will never see them in the flesh. I'm not in the Louvre, I'm not in the museums. And where maybe a few hundred people will see a picture in the gallery space, tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of people can see it through reproduction. And for those people, they may not really care how the image is made. It may be very important to me, but in that context, I'm essentially competing with the digital artists, with the people just, making images on their iPads and all the rest. And there may be a sort of an equivalency that occurs at that level. What isn't equivalent is the economics, because I think what I have is the unique individual work at the end of this, which has a high value simply because of the fact that it's individual. And the digital artist doesn't necessarily have that because it is essentially, as a digital work, it is infinitely reproducible. So there may be an opening there for the visual artist the painter to survive simply because the work has automatically a very high value in the age of mass production. And it may be much more difficult to monetize the value of the purely digital work. But that is a lot of what I see behind the sort of the fetishization of the unique work today. As a technical question of how the work is made, I'm not sure it really matters so much.
Perhaps there is some symbiotic relationship between the actual embodied painting versus the virtual. But also, one of the things that I thought about during this time now, when we've done, here in the UK, we've done something called Support the Artist Pledge, where a whole lot of artists, I can't remember the guy who started it, essentially is artists take a piece of work, the maximum amount of money they can sell it for is £200, and as soon as they've sold 5 pieces of art, the pledge is that they will buy a piece of art for within that price range. And I think there's been this sort of mass democratization of art. A lot of artists who were holding on to work, or perhaps, painting great big paintings, are suddenly making this really properly good living at the moment, selling lots of smaller paintings. And there's something quite nice about owning an actually authentic piece of art that's suddenly become accessible to the people who should be enjoying it most. And I pose this question to an artist friend of mine, what would you rather have? One big painting that you're holding out for a collector to put in a collection, it never gets seen, or smaller paintings to lots of people who can afford to buy it? Or do you immediately go to print? You create this amazing painting and then do prints of it. You've suddenly got 10,000 Instagram followers that just love this piece of art, want to actually see it in their home as a tangible thing, but can't afford the real thing. Before we would not go to print because we're holding on to the sacredness of the actual original piece. And maybe there is a way that, this whole world, as I see it, we as artists, painters especially, we're just craftspeople. From the minute the first person smeared a piece of clay on a cave wall and went, whoa, look at that mark I've made, that everyone else, and this sort of surge of joy that's come down. I think art belongs to absolutely everybody, and painting has become kind of elitist thing. Very wealthy people can actually own the actual painting. So,
again, it's that idea of maybe moving away from the good and bad response, the very binary response to things, and seeing that, like Conor was saying, and I think like Mike was also saying, that there is something about all of the different media. And actually, for example, Conor's idea that the more an image is reproduced, the more then the original is going to have value because it's suddenly been circulating. I think that we can see this virtual explosion as an opportunity and as a way of reprogramming the way that we see things. Even events like this. At the moment, I'm really interested in the idea of questioning, for example, these elitist art events like art fairs, where you'll get a certain group of people who are just getting on a plane and traveling around the world to kind of just say, I've been there, I've done that. And this idea of kind of using the best of the virtual, i.e. to connect people, but keeping the best of the embodied in works of art. It means that we can act both globally and virtually, and also in a local and embodied way at the same time. I don't know, I just throw that out as an idea.
I think we live in an extraordinarily complex world, and there's plenty of room for all of these things, and they're all going to happen. The elitist art world is going to carry on being elitist. It's not going to stop just because we don't like it or want to be a part of it. And a thought occurred to me about Bohemia. The 19th century Bohemians struggled for democratization because they felt that there was a new market there. The elite of the 19th century who were buying art in the first part of the century were aristocratic. And during the 19th century, you saw a vast industrialization that spread the market out and enlarged the market to include a more middle class and petit bourgeois interest in art, right? And you saw Louis Napoleon opening up the salon for those people and making it a more democratic world. And I think we're seeing almost exactly the same thing now. This is the analog of that. The internet is allowing for the democratization of art in very much the same way. So one of the things that is interesting me is the digital bohemia of painters that the internet has allowed. I think it's creating new circumstances for us, which are very much exploitable in the way that Conor is suggesting. That we can create a sort of a sniper culture, a culture of guerrilla action that allows us to be seen and seen widely, and then make use of the digital tool that we have to percolate the work throughout the world in imagery. Especially if the imagery is dramatic and eye-catching and successful in the digital sense, right? I found myself making imagery that is more deliberately geared towards the internet than I used to.
Well, I've got to say, you guys are all lucky because you have to know what I paint. I'm up against the censorship.
Facebook censored immediately, right?
Totally. You know, I mean, that's the thing that gets me. The patriarchal gaze just strangleholds it. I mean, it's really, it's all very well. I mean, I'm all for the digital, but, you know, Instagram completely throttles me all of the time across all channels. And you know, it just goes to show that the female body is absolutely out there, and you know, but the last taboo we have is the unveiled male body. So yeah,
I've been nuked for female bodies too. I don't think this is entirely gender oriented. They'll censor any nude body, won't they?
I have, you know, there's Instagram accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers. And the guy doing the drawings, I mean, they explicit female nudes, and it, you know, he'll get 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, you know, gazillions of likes on his images, and you know, I just struggled despite trying to work the wretched system, which I loathe and despise, but it has to be done.
So Conor, you seem to be more in symbiosis with it in the way that you work, because in the recent work that you've done, like that wonderful Trump ambiguous portrait is actually playing with that very mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I can't set myself up as an example of the artist terrorist. You know, I'm not any way good at it. But it's a thought experiment for me of how I should be doing things if I was any good, if I was to you know, work the system, and if I was much younger, you know, because I'm nearly 50 years old now, and I sort of think, well, if I was 20, what would I be? You know, how would I approach it? You know, how do you set out to conquer the system today? It probably being a little bit late for some of us, but we might be able to pass on a few tricks and a few bits of wisdom about where we went wrong, or you know, some of the things that we've seen work along the way. And to some extent, I think it's like you have to look at some of the artists from outside our circle who have done well, and you have to look at Banksy and Damien Hirst and some of these people who have, more than anything else, I think, mastered the mass media in order to get their work before an audience. It's not that they're necessarily very good painters. It's that they're very clever in how they present the work. And that is, you need some combination. It would be great if you could get a really good painter with the presentational skills, the marketing skills that some of the conceptualists and more trendy artists exploit.
Damien Hirst is a figurative sculptor these days, more than anything else, I think. Has been for a long time.
Sorry, yeah, it's a big shift, but I also think that Damien Hirst is the perfect chimerical being who will adapt to what the market needs. It's
right. Isn't it interesting that he becomes a figurative artist now, right? I think that he's understood that representation is something that that more people understand. It's more accessible than avant-garde, weird, conceptual stuff.
So that kind of links to this idea that I'm really interested at the moment, and I know it's a really complicated one, so I'm going to be careful how I sort of try to formulate this. But there has been recently, I think, this general shift in the zeitgeist, a notion that there is a move towards a slightly more constructive rather than disillusioned model of functioning. And I know it's a complicated thing to say because obviously there are situations in which the aim is to just break the current status quo without necessarily having ideals. But do you also feel that there has been this kind of shift in the narratives and the stories that are being told through painting, which opens up, again, going back to the force of representation, it opens up the power of storytelling within figurative work?
I think figurative work has changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. In the last part of the 20th century, many of us had the same exact story, that we were not allowed to be figurative painters. We went to colleges and universities where we were told that figurative work was dead and avant-gardism was the only way to go. That has gone completely. And now, of course, you're seeing young people coming up, and they specifically want to learn how to draw because they know it's a necessary tool for what they do. So we do live in a very different world. And what Conor said earlier on, I think that the idea that we've somehow, we're kind of late to the game, I don't think that's true at all. I think it's a wonderful game. This is a fabulous world. What a great time, because it was so bad in the 90s and 80s. It was so bad, and now it's just fabulous. I love this. Full of opportunity.
Have you seen shifts in the way, this is kind of an open question to all of you, but have you seen a shift in the stories that you're telling in your own work happening?
I have. Yeah, very much. Very much.
I'm way too new to the game. My stories are I'm beginning. So I've come to this very, very late. So no time for them to change yet.
What about you, Conor?
I don't know. I always feel like I'm about 3 or 4 years behind in my head. I'm working on pictures we imagined 10 years ago, and I'm finally getting. So, I really don't know where I am now. I'm just behind myself.
I'm just full of joy, really. The whole thing is wonderful. I'm painting the stuff I wish I painted when I was 16 and can. I feel like I've got permission. It's fantastic. What a great time to be alive and to be able to do this, because no one is saying no. Nobody says no. If you're painting something and it's good, you're going to find your audience for it somewhere. And it might not be a gigantic audience, and it might not win the lottery, you might not be the next Damien Hirst, but you can do it now in ways that you couldn't do before.
I think the reason that nobody's saying no is that we are seen to be impotent. We're totally unthreatening. if we were in any way threatening, people would be saying no. But that just isn't the case. I think we're so far out on the margin that, yeah, we can do what we like, but it's not, I don't think it's an entirely strong position.
I don't agree at all. We're not on the margin. We're seeing auction results coming in. Paintings are selling for millions of dollars that are selling at heritage auctions, and they're our people. It's our stuff. You know, we're not on the margins anymore. We have our own world. We have a growing and successful bubble. We're doing very nicely. I know you're a pessimist, Conor. I'm the opposite. I'm very optimistic. I think this is great.
Well, perhaps the great time for us as representational artists comes from the pessimism. You know, when times of crisis happen, I think humanity goes back to what it always knows, to the familiar. You know, we don't have the energy to challenge or to change. We just kind of want to recognize something and go to a place where we can find solace or explanation for our experience. And I think representational art has perhaps always held that. You know, it's where humanity goes to make sense of the crap, or to take a break from it, you know, in those moments, to create those experiences. So
but it can be.
Elina, you were kind of hinting at utopianism earlier on, and I don't think that utopianism is an answer to this. I don't believe in utopia. I think it's nice to have idealism and to try to find a better world, but an awful lot of people in the world are kind of assholes, and we're not going to dispose of assholery in the world. And so I think a sense of realism is really quite useful, not necessarily in the sense of social realism, by the way. I hesitate to tie representational art to social justice causes and propaganda.
But it's really interesting, because I wasn't actually trying to put forward the idea of utopianism. I think that there is a shift in point of view generally towards something that is more constructive rather than resigned, and that is just a social kind of in all spheres and all facets of life. Even actually the fact that there is uprising means that people are starting to reactivate, not necessarily in a constructive way, but I think that there's some form of energy that's happening, a movement that's happening, and it's that idea of engaging with the world. I think that, again, it's going back to the notion of bubbles. There are so many different options. You can create work that is a form of respite or solace. You can create work which is a confrontation with the hard realities of society. You can create worlds that are trying to play. I guess that the things that really interest me at the moment are the notions of interpretation and ambiguity that are so inherent to neurological structures in the brain, and the way in which figurative art allows you to play with both indeterminacy and narrative at the same time. And so you're almost left with a sort of Bechettian tableau, or a moment, a very condensed moment of allegory or metaphor or aphorism in work, which then forces the spectator to then reposition themselves and make the work with you. That's always been the case, but I think that figurative, anything that is representational, it could be in literature, it could be in painting, has that notion of the excitement of completing ambiguity or responding to ambiguity.
That by weaving new stories, we can effect a change on culture. I mean, you know, culture is the thread that holds humanity together. What comes first, art or culture? And as we create the new stories, can we then sway a whole outlook and a whole culture towards a new outlook in creating the stories that we as artists, how we respond to our world? New mythologies, as you say, new stories.
And that's that.
Yeah, I think those new mythologies are incredibly important, and we do need those. The death of God hasn't gone away, and we don't have an ethical system to replace it, it doesn't seem. Conor's going to be pretty good at this, I'm sure. He knows a great deal of philosophy. But I suspect that the decline of Christianity has caused this failure of ethics and failure of hierarchy that actually kept the world in order in the past. And so part of what we're seeing this century has been chaos caused by that failure. And I don't know where you find that new ethics, but creating a new mythology, as we did in the Renaissance, probably isn't such a bad idea.
But it's that idea of whether we're responsive and just communicating the spirit of the times, or if there is that ability to actually mold it. And I think that, again, it's not a black and white question. There is both, of course.
Sure. Yeah. Each feeds the other. It's the chicken and the egg. It's the unanswerable question. Right? Both feed each other all the time. I think they always have.
I think the
ethics. You are seeing an ethical commitment in popular movie making. If you look at all these superhero movies, I think if you analyze those, you would find an ethical system emerging.
I think that there was a question that I saw. I haven't been able to catch up with all of the questions that have been popping up. I'm not sure there have been many questions, but one of them was about what form does the asymmetrical warfare actually, how does it actually kind of manifest itself? What kind of skirmishes and how does that, I don't know, Conor?
I think it's part of the idea behind asymmetrical warfare is to actually to accept the position as the underdog, to accept the position as the marginal figure, that we're the Indians, and the cowboys are more powerful, that we have to fight with bows and arrows, where our opposition, or those that we are competing against, are much more heavily armed with technology, essentially, and with the mass media. And it's how you approach that. I think it's really any way you can. It's about survival. And it may be, it's not about a campaign with masked battalions. It's to some extent everyone for himself, and trying to find a way to survive. But that would be my sense. I'm not trying to say that that there's you read The Art of War or whatever, this is what you have to do. I think it's really a matter of locating ourselves and understanding ourselves within the world, of where we how we locate ourselves, how we see ourselves going forward, and whether it's where we're going, if that makes sense.
I suspect the question, I didn't see the question because I can't concentrate on the chat room and on what we're talking about, but I suspect the question had more to do with action and action items. I'm a big fan of action coming out of meetings, and what do people do? So what do we do? We have this conversation, we could pat ourselves on the back and and that's it, or we can make decisions about what to do next, and at least talk about what to do next, and how individuals can take action in order to make the cause of representational art stronger. And I think that that's probably what they were looking for, Conor. I suspect that actually we're already doing at least part of that. I personally, my action is to write, and I've managed to get into writing journalistic articles to try and put representational art on an equal footing in the auction world at Mutual Art. And I think that there are many of us who are quite articulate. Conor, you could do this. You're a good thinker and a good writer. You've got something to say. I would urge you to start writing. Elina, start writing. Get articles, submit articles to the press. Get people looking. And that's the action that we need in asymmetrical warfare. If you're going to get representational art out there to the public, we have needed, and we do need an intellectual and literary commentary upon what it is that we're up to. So if you're looking for action that's a part of asymmetrical warfare, I recommend doing a bit of casual journalism. You might even make a bit of money at it.
I think there's also, the mainstream culture is almost inevitably optimistic. We're all encouraged to be optimistic and believe that, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, because our whole financial system is built on confidence, and the whole sort of business as usual model, proposes that we keep doing what we're doing and be blind to some extent to the ill effects of it. And I think part of asymmetrical warfare is critique. It is actually, the advantage of accepting the marginal viewpoint is that you are much freer to attack, because you don't have so many vested interests. You can actually denounce. You can play Jeremiah and say what a fucking mess we're in. Excuse my language. And that is something I think an engagement with the aesthetic of tragedy is also really critical. I think the progressive modernist viewpoint of everything's getting better and everything's going to be wonderful and there's a future ahead of us really needs to be thoroughly, systematically undermined with a very gritty look at what we're actually doing and the disaster that's unfolding around.
So one of the things that came up in our group was the notion of how the demographic of a group of representational painters tends to be too limited, and I think it's an elephant in the room that needs to be thrown out there. And it's an interesting question, how to then actually.
We basically spoke about, I guess, touching briefly on the idea of asymmetrical warfare and what it's like to be an older representational artist in the current time, and how do we navigate these waters, and how, I guess talking about the millennials and Generation Z who are coming up, who have completely different habits, and how they first interact with art, and how we can engage with them. And one of the questions I meant to ask Michael, I can't see him on my screen, but he talks about writing and writing articles and getting the work out there. But the one thing I will say is Generation Z and the millennials don't bloody read. And it's a bit preaching to the choir, okay? What they do watch are 6-second vines, and they do watch Instagram stories. And I think that writing to it, I write to my art in small paragraphs on Instagram or Facebook. I mean, I remember posting something that was very heartfelt and very authentic when I did a self-portrait. And my son said to me, "For God's sake, Mum, I stopped reading after like 3 sentences. Like, what the fuck? Stop." I'm like, really? Like, I'm writing authentically, not interested. Attention span of a gnat. We're all readers. We're of a generation that was raised the latchkey kids who did nothing but read books. I spent my entire teenage years in my room alone reading nonstop. Okay. It's just, I mean, obviously I'm generalizing, but I watch my kids and they're watching TV. They've got their laptops open and a mobile phone, and they're interacting with all 3 genres, and none of it's reading. If it's more than 2 sentences, they're not engaging with it. So we, as older representational artists, have to find a way to engage the new buyers, the people that we want, affect change with. And as tough as it is, I think we have to use Conor's guerrilla strategies to actually figure out how to work this system. It's not too late to teach old dogs new tricks.
The way is video. I think what people won't read, they will watch you say. So I think one thing that we have to do, okay, you can write your essay, but if you can actually present it in a coherent, exciting audiovisual way, say it, what people are interested today is partly authenticity. And I think if you can make eye contact with your audience through the camera, if you can explain yourself, if you can talk about your work, if you can talk about how it's made, if you can show through video, through time lapse and all of that sort of thing, people really engage with that. They're interested in the process and we have all the technological tools to show the process. And if we can also say, you know, put 2 minutes together saying, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm about, you get people, you know. That's my experience.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I post processed videos, as painful as it is, of the way I'm working, and you master the art of the time lapse. People absolutely love it, because I think part of being an artist is sharing your gift. So there are a lot of people coming up who are at art school, young art students. They really want this whole process demystified. They want to know how you get that glorious painting on the wall. And there is massive engagement and a lot of gratitude and a lot of emotional bonding when you share the process. And I think that is, the way to go. I mean, I think the galleries before put a big, huge wall up between the artist and the audience. And there wasn't really a way to engage fully with the audience. And I think this new world, is a chance to rewrite that.
Yeah, I think if we can take a leaf from the performance artists and actually think more like performance artists, and think of the studio as an arena that is semi-public now, that it's not totally private. You're not just your cave, that you are actually putting as much as you can of what you do on display, and being metaphorically nude, being naked and showing off what the whole business is about. And particularly in an age of really, really processed work, where everything that you see on TV and whatever is just, for the most part, so slick, so luxury, so processed, that our capacity as individuals to speak with an authentic voice and to use this, the ubiquitous technology now to present an individual viewpoint on the world, I think that's what we can do now.
I mean, I personally think it's critical. I mentioned I'd read a McKinsey report on the habits of Generation Z, and one of the things that they prize more than anything else is authenticity. And in fact, using the technology, and they are the first generation fully raised in the digital age, they will research a company. They will check to see its credentials and its social and ethical background before they buy the product. And they will turn away from something that even smacks of being mildly inauthentic. And sharing the story is part of that. And so, yeah, we have to embrace those guerrilla tactics. Personally, I'd like to stay in my cave and be found and just paint, Unfortunately, 50% of my day is that wretched Instagram account and Facebook, and trying to navigate all of it. I mean, but I don't know how else to get what it is I need to say out,
I think I'm going to open it up to if any questions arise, or if anyone has something to say. Let's see how we can do it as a large group. What would be really good is just to kind of keep little interventions as short as possible and finish maybe with a question or just some thoughts. So if anyone wants to share ideas, and one of the things that came up, that Emma Brassington, who's one of the painters but also filmmakers, works in multimedia, lots of different media, raised was this question of demographic when we bring together representational painting. And it's true that looking around the room, the demographic is often quite limited. And so the idea is, with these dialogues, is it has artists in the name. Artist is actually a word that I tend to try and avoid, because it's such a laden and problematic baggage. It can be expedient sometimes, but the idea is to interpret that in its widest sense, so makers and thinkers generally. And so the sessions in the future, there will be some that are focused on painting, and talking about the specifics of painting. But the idea is also to open up to writers, thinkers, filmmakers, poets, multimedia artists, and really try and see how we can create exchange in this community.
I have a question for Conor, I think primarily again. Conor, at track 18, Nerdrum proposed, I don't know if this would be part of your asymmetric warfare, he proposed a symmetrical proposal, which was to establish two forms of academy, one that continued the present non-representational line, and the other would be academy that had representational foundations. What do you think about that? Is that part of, would that be a legitimate part of the asymmetric battle that you talked about?
I've seen an attempt to do that in Dublin through the Royal Hibernian Academy, and I think it is ironically it's misfired. I think there's too much of a tendency to go back to an old version of the academy, which is sort of authoritarian in its structures and its conception of itself. You know, it's the notion of a curriculum, and it's top down, and this is how you paint, and we're gonna, you know, you're gonna sit in class and we're gonna teach you how to do it. And I think I don't think that really works anymore. What I saw working really well was at an earlier stage in the development of that, which is basically, you know, where, let's say you had a life drawing session and you had really good artists working alongside students, and there was very little actual teaching going on, but there was a hell of a lot of learning going on. And I think decentralized, more you know, less hierarchical structures suit the age that we're in, and the internet, and all of that sort of thing. You know, I think those who can should teach by example, and Odd, of course, is doing that. And he's, you know, he set up his own you know, private little you know, school, but it's turned into a little bit of a personality cult, and they all tend to dress like him, and all the rest. And that's, you know, and that's fine. And he's like, I really admire what he's doing, but I don't think it's scalable. You know, I don't think we should really be trying to do that. I think the resources are already out there, and we can network and connect in different ways. I think students should go directly to the artists that they're interested in and pick their brains, because that's what the whole system offers now.
One of the things that came up in the group that I talked with was also this notion of how collective and collaborative practice is so important, and yet to a certain extent painters are quite despotic in their way of working. They are, of course, closed off in their own spaces, so confinement hasn't necessarily been a huge change in the modus operandi, but it does beg the question of when we talk about co-creation or about collaborative meaning making, that usually in painting we are clutching at the straws of finished work. So usually the collaborative process comes in the interpretive role, and the way in which the audience or the viewer then closes a piece of work. And so this question of how is it an uncomfortable question? Can we open up painting to a more collaborative sphere? Is it just alien to its very being? Any thoughts? Then I really thank you all for having been here, and it's been a wonderful evening. It's a strange forum to bring together so many people on a flat screen in tiny little images, but I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm excited to have seen so many different people. We might try next time more breakout rooms. Feel free to send feedback, ideas, people you'd like to see in this forum, how it could grow beyond just painting, and let's see where we can take it together. Thank you again, Conor Walton.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jane Clatworthy. Thank you, Michael Pearce, although he's not here, for being speakers.
Thank you.
It's been good fun and very interesting ideas.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Everyone.